Today, we are diving into a different fatty acid. You've been on the show at least a couple of times now, talking specifically about omega-3s, which is, of course, a primary area of interest and research for you. But today, we're going to talk about pentadecanoic acid, which is a mouthful, and we'll shorten that to C15. And I thought maybe I could provide a little bit of a background here for the listeners as to why we're catching up to talk about this fatty acid in particular. So this is a saturated fat, an odd chain saturated fat that really has kind of been thrust into the spotlight by a company called Fatty15, which is led by a scientist, a veterinary epidemiologist, Dr. Stephanie Van Watson, who first studied this fat in dolphins. And then her team have gone from there and researched this fatty acid alongside some independent studies that also exist. And they've patented this C15 supplement that they market with pretty bold claims, everything from improving liver function and metabolism to enhanced longevity, which of course right now is a huge buzz. And now, with the impending release of her new book, The Longevity Nutrient, the hype around this fat is really only growing. And I have listeners, we were just talking off air, I have listeners, honestly, every week I'm getting something on social media or email, and now it's becoming closer to daily about this product. People saying, hey, Simon, you've spoken with Bill Harris and you've had all these experts on the show to talk about fats, but you've never really mentioned C15. So with all of that buzz, I thought, well, why don't I get an expert back on the show who has spent their career studying fatty acids to evaluate the claims that are being made, the current research, and ultimately help the listeners understand whether they should supplement with this fat or not. But perhaps more importantly, provide people with some ways of thinking and some tools when they come across various marketing claims from supplement companies online. So with that background out of the way, so people kind of understand why we're here, I think a great place to start, given your deep expertise in omega-3s, is how Fatty15 is positioning this C15 fat as the next omega-3, an essential fat that we've been under-consuming with major health benefits. When you first came across that claim, this kind of direct comparison to omega-3s, what were your initial thoughts?
My initial thoughts were interesting. Let's see what the data say. Obviously, just making a claim doesn't, if there's no substantive data behind it, it's not very compelling. Yeah, I mean, I've been part of publications on C15 and C17, which is the other, we'll call dairy fats. That's really where we get these fatty acids, is in dairy fat. And I think the claim that's been made is that standard recommendations are for years have been to use low fat or fat-free dairy, which would reduce, of course, this is a very tiny part of the fatty acid composition of dairy fat, but it's in there. So people have, if they follow the advice of the American Heart, all the other heart associations, to reduce their dairy fat intake, then they've reduced their intake of C15 and C17, because these are fatty acids that are made in the cow's udder. That's where it's produced. And it's made and finds its way into milk, of course. Originally the components of C15 from which the udder makes the fatty acid are really short chain fatty acids produced in the rumen by bacteria. So that's fine. So what? We have looked at blood levels of C15 and C17, and we have always looked at them as biomarkers of dairy intake. You ask people how much cheese do they eat, how much milk do they drink. That's one way to get at dairy intake, but it's much better to measure fatty acids that are specific to dairy. Do you have a question?
on looking at the blood kind of concentrations of C15 and C17, my understanding is that at that level of research, there has been a pretty consistent finding where these particular saturated fats, which perhaps we can distinguish from some of the other saturated fats in dairy, like palmitic acid, these particular odd chain saturated fats, C15 and C17, would you agree that it's not controversial that they have been associated with good health outcomes generally over the years?
Yeah, I mean, the one area I know particularly about is in terms of type 2 diabetes, reducing risk for developing type 2 diabetes. So that's metabolic health. So writ large, yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with that idea. The way it's typically been interpreted is that dairy fats are good for you. It doesn't mean that C15 is an essential fatty acid. That's not necessarily the case, because in nutrition we have a pretty high bar for essential fatty acids, a fatty acid without which you would die. That evidence is not here. If you don't take C15 by mouth, kind of like vitamin C, it's kind of the classic. And it doesn't fulfill that criteria by any stretch of the imagination.
You mentioned dairy fats there, right? And one of the kind of foundational things that I've seen Fatty15 using in their marketing is that these odd chain fatty acids are health promoting, whereas even chain saturated fats like palmitic acid are not. So it brings us into this territory of saturated fats not all being equal, and there are different types. So maybe we can double click on that and explain that to the listener. But central to their kind of thesis is that, hey, these odd chain fatty acids, C15 in particular, are really healthy, but we're not saying that you should go out and eat more dairy, because if you did that, you would get way too much of these even chain saturated fats. So what we recommend is to have an isolated form of C15 so that you're getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and there's some logic in that. I mean, I don't deny that there's some logic in that. It's all a matter of balancing risk and benefit. If on the whole, a higher dairy fat intake, fine, palmitic acid will raise LDL cholesterol. We know that. Certainly in randomized trials, we've seen that. But it's possible that even that particularly adverse, we would say, effect of one fatty acid in dairy might be completely reversed and overcome by a beneficial effect of some other, not only a fatty acid, but calcium, phosphorus, all the other nutrients that are in milk. Net effect on human health is what we care about. And the net effect on human health of dairy fat appears to be good, even if one of the components of dairy fat, palmitic acid, which we can make anyway, we can synthesize palmitic acid, might tend to raise cholesterol levels. Other components might, even if the cholesterol goes up, that doesn't mean all of a sudden heart disease risk is higher.
It's such an important point, because we can get so reductionist and focus on one nutrient affecting one pathway, when, as you say, even that single nutrient could be affecting other pathways. You have the whole food matrix, which is affecting pathways kind of beyond our comprehension. So at some point, you have to zoom out, as you say. So when in these studies you're talking about that looked at C15 and showed some, say, reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, for example, what I'm hearing is that that's not necessarily saying that C15, that should be attributed to C15. We're using C15 as a biomarker of dairy intake in general. And so it's suggestive that the consumption of dairy foods here is associated with the reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. Would that be a fair summary?
That's fair, right? And I'm guilty of this on the omega-3 side at times. I fully admit, because when I see associations between omega-3 and longevity, whatever outcome, you attribute it to the omega-3s when actually it could be, in theory, there's a much stronger case on the omega-3 side, much more research. But in theory, it could be that the selenium you get in seafood that comes along with omega-3 is what's really beneficial. And the omega-3 is just a marker of seafood intake, and you're just not measuring the thing that really is helpful. So observational studies linking things like that have to be taken with a grain of salt.
It's curious to me, and so I'm going to get a little reductionist here for a moment. It's curious to me that C15 is saturated fat. Palmitic acid is C16. So there are these different saturated fats, and those two only differ by one carbon, right? Yet they could have quite different effects on physiology. Can you explain to the listener, I guess, the difference between some of these long chain saturated fats and why not they may have quite different effects on health?
Yeah, in theory, I don't know that I've ever seen anybody directly compare in an animal or a cell culture or in a human C16 and C15, for whatever outcome. But you're right; they differ by one carbon, and the C15 is one a little bit shorter, 1/15 shorter. It will be incorporated just like C16 into the adipose tissue. We store it in adipose tissue as triglyceride. It can be incorporated in membranes to some extent, but it's very, very small amount in membranes. Less than 0.2% of membrane fatty acids are C15, whereas C16 is maybe 20% of the membrane fatty acids. Why one would have a vastly different effect than the other is a little hard to imagine, and it's a matter of imagination at this point, because I've not seen anybody actually show that there's a difference in activity of these two. You can imagine, anything can happen in the dark inside your body. Maybe C15 is made into some other molecule that has some good effect, or C16 is incorporated into some other form, and that has an effect. I mean, all this stuff is just it's blue skying at this point. I think that's why we hate to, as scientists, we just want to look at the data, do the experiment, look at the outcome, and then interpret it and move on.
And look at more harder outcomes, be it risk of developing a disease or change to biomarkers that we know have been established as important biomarkers that kind of predict risk of disease or outcomes. You mentioned that C15, it seemed like you alluded to the fact you don't think it's an essential fat. Yet Fatty15 are certainly claiming that this is the first essential fat to be discovered in, I think, 90 years, they say. So by definition, Bill, what is an essential fat?
It's a fat that, number one, we can't make in sufficient quantities to meet our needs. The absence of it from the diet would lead to some diseases, presumably at the end, death. Just because a fatty acid has bioactivity, because it does something, doesn't make it essential. Just means it's bioactive. I mean, in the same way, I would say that EPA and DHA are not essential fatty acids. I mean, there are cultures that completely eat no fish at all, no meat at all. They're vegan, vegetarian, consume no omega-3, no long-chain omega-3s, and yet they live and reproduce just fine. There may be some health consequences to having a low EPA and DHA level, and we think maybe in vegans that's true. But that doesn't make EPA and DHA essential in the classic nutritional. It makes them helpful, but it doesn't make them essential. Same, I'd say, for C15. It's possible that C15 does something.
So by definition, if it was essential, you would see some type of deleterious effect in the short term versus long term?
It depends on, it's not as short term as vitamin C and scurvy. but it's long term, decades. I suppose you'd have to look potentially. I think it's interesting that in the old day, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, as they were discovering, vitamins and minerals, or the essentiality of them, and they would there is a particular diet called the ASN some number, American Society of Nutrition. It's a completely synthetic diet with every nutrient known to be essential, including essential fatty acids. And that diet, rats, for example, a mammal, can live and reproduce for generations upon generations upon generations. And there's no C15 in that diet. So it's not essential. It's not essential for rats. And there's no good evidence it's essential for humans either.
So have you looked at the evidence that they put forward to kind of substantiate this claim that they believe C15 is essential?
Yeah. And there's very little of it. So it's real easy to look at the literature on this, because in terms of human studies, there I think are now two. One specifically giving their product, another one done in China where they added C15 to a soy milk product and then fed it with them, as part of a Mediterranean diet, and fed it to Chinese women with liver disease. So those are the only two studies in humans that have been done. I don't believe any studies have been done in experimental animals where they add or remove C15 and show that there are deleterious effects. It's what you'd have to do.
Does our body make C15?
By and large, we don't. We could potentially get it from our gut bacteria and absorb it in the lower intestines, either the large intestine or the distal small intestine. So it could be produced in our body, but not synthesized by our mammalian cells.
Gotcha. So that makes sense then, going back to why when you look at these populations and you get circulating concentrations, you can use that as a proxy for dairy intake, because it's presumed that the body's not really making any of this.
Not making much. I'm sure it's detectable. Again, you would have to feed a diet. This is the way a normal scientist would do it. Feed a diet completely devoid of C15. And if you measure blood levels of C15 to detect it, then it's got to be synthesized somewhere, because you're not eating it. But exactly where, you could do some tests to figure out if it's in the gut or where else it's being made, but probably in the gut.
So right now, your position would be that C15 is not essential. There hasn't been enough evidence to kind of substantiate that claim. That said, I guess if we look at EPA, DHA, or even creatine, just because a nutrient is not essential by classical definition of an essential nutrient, it doesn't mean that supplementing with it could lead to a more optimal outcome. Would that also be fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Certainly. The door is wide open for a C15 supplement to do something that's helpful. It just hasn't been demonstrated yet.
So what about this idea that, continuing on from that kind of, I'll call it a story that this brand's putting forward, that over the last 40 years, as you said, there's been a recommendation to consume less dairy fat, to go from full fat to low fat. And with that, they're essentially putting forward this case that 1 in 3 people are deficient of C15, and I've seen them describe it as cellular fragility syndrome.
It's a great name, isn't it? Huh? Why can we come up with that kind of stuff? It is tremendous marketing, because there is no basis in fact for any of this. But if you just say these really cool words like cellular fragility, sounds like your cells are going to fall apart if you haven't got this. But they haven't really demonstrated that's true.
What about the claims that they make, which I think they're making more from clinical trials, that C15 can improve important markers of cardiometabolic health, which would be particularly beneficial for people with cardiovascular disease or metabolic syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, like lowering cholesterol or improving blood glucose control or lowering liver enzymes and improving liver function.
Right. And they have published one paper looking at that from first authors Robinson, published in Journal of Nutrition last year. And in that study, they had 30 people, overweight, mean BMI of 33, age 20. So, pretty young and pretty fat. So presumably metabolically disordered. That would make sense. They gave them 200 milligrams a day, which is one capsule, I believe, of the C15, or a placebo. And they did it for 12 weeks. Told them to keep their diet, everything else the same. It's the way you'd normally do it. That 200 milligrams is about how much you would get in 2 to 3 pats of butter. So this is not a unachievable intake. In any event, their primary objective in the study was something about just changing C15 plasma levels. Okay, well, that's not a very ambitious goal. You give C15 in the mouth and see if it shows up in the blood. Well, okay, it's a little bit like publishing a paper saying if I put a drop of blue food dye in a glass of water, it's going to turn blue. It's not. Okay, anyway. And then they were also looking for safety and tolerability. What they found was only half of the people who got the C15 had an increase in blood C15 levels. The other half didn't, which is
I thought that was interesting, actually, Bill. So there are responders and non-responders, maybe?
Well, that's one way of saying it. Yeah. So why do you not absorb it? Why do you not get it in your? Maybe it gets burned up as soon as it gets into your blood, but that's disturbing because right away, half of the people that are taking this product are not increasing their blood their blood C15 levels. That's what you'd imply from this study, that only you got a 50-50 chance of this doing anything, at least in terms of blood levels. So that's not very impressive. I think the other thing they reported in this, they looked at 15 different blood tests, some of them liver function tests, some blood pressure, some body weight, BMI, lipid levels, lipoprotein levels. And they couldn't find anything except that one of the liver function tests called GGT, so it's an enzyme that liver cells have in them, and if there's any damage in the liver, this enzyme finds its way, I guess, it's loosed into the blood, and then you have an idea, there's liver damage. And what they found, there's 3 of them, 3 different enzymes like that, AST, ALT, and GGT. 2 of them had no effect at all. One of them, GGT, in the treatment group, the group that got C15, the levels were 33 and 32 before and after, no change. Okay, didn't do anything. The levels went from 37 to 47 in the placebo group, so they kind of went up a little bit. So to interpret that as C15 is lowering your liver function test is a little bit dicey because actually just didn't. The placebo group, my question is what happened to the placebo group? How come it went up? And it still was within the normal range. All of these numbers are in the normal range. So we're not.
So how clinically meaningful is this?
Not at all. Right. So, and the other 2 liver function tests didn't change at all. And nothing else. No glucose didn't change, insulin, CRP, LDL, HDL, none of that stuff changed. So there's not a lot to say about what's the effect of. I think they concluded that it demonstrated an increase in C15 concentrations. They don't mention in their conclusion that it was only in half the patients. But if you pull them all together, there was statistically significant increase.
If you're serious about optimizing your health, I've got something for you. 8 Sleep and their revolutionary Pod 4 Ultra. The Pod 4 Ultra is not just a mattress cover, it is an entire sleep system. With advanced temperature control and biometric tracking, the pod has helped me take my sleep and recovery to the next level. And as someone who is always looking to optimize health, better sleep means better everything. Focus, energy, workouts, and even better communication with my partner, Tawny. What makes the Pod 4 Ultra so incredible? Well, it learns your sleep patterns and adjusts the temperature automatically throughout the night, optimizing your body temperature during the 4 stages of sleep. If you're ready to take your sleep and recovery to the next level, head over to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF to get $350 off your very own Pod 4 Ultra. The best part is that you still get 30 days to try it at home and return it if you don't like it, but I'm confident you'll keep it. Trust me, your body will thank you for this investment in better sleep. Shipping to many countries worldwide. See details at 8sleep.com/theproof.
Right.
Which is very different to, like, say something like choline. It's been a little while since I looked at this research, but I remember going through it, and back in the day when they were looking at choline being essential, there were some studies done where they restricted choline to below 50 milligrams a day and saw quite deleterious changes to liver function. And then were able to show that when you added in an amount around 400 or 500 milligrams a day, you were able to remove those deleterious kind of changes to liver, which comes back to testing for essentiality.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If that had happened here, it would have been it would support the view that they're healthy, but it didn't really change anything. They conclude that individuals, well, here they're looking now at just the people who responded. The 50% of people who responded, they say the people who reached circulating level of 5 microgram per mil in C15, that's the responders, were linked to improvements in laboratory values that hold potential clinical significance. And here again, it's the, now they're looking at a different liver enzyme that the responders had some kind of change, and it was ALT, again, all values within normal range. And so there was a small change there, but this is not a marker of cellular aging or oxidative damage or any of the cellular fragility things they're talking about. This is making a molehill out of a mountain. Mountain out of a molehill. That's the way it goes. Yeah, there's nothing compelling about this particular report.
It gets difficult for the consumer, right? When that study was at least partly funded by this supplement company, which I have no problem with. I think it's hard to get funding, so I think industry funding studies is required to push science forward. But it is difficult if you're not trained to look at the data like you are, and you just read the discussion and the conclusion,
or just read the abstract,
right?
Yeah, or you just read the headline. I mean, that's what most people do.
Or the claim on the website with like the little asterisk next to it and a scientific reference at the bottom, and you just assume that that's robust.
Right, exactly. It's disappointing. Perhaps it's disappointing that the peer reviewers, whoever they were, I mean, again, if the point of this paper is simply to show what's the effect of 200 milligrams of C15 on blood C15 levels, okay. It's fine. Half the people went up, half the people didn't. It's worth reporting, but you don't go beyond those conclusions. You don't say, well, therefore it's going to save the world.
Yeah, because it seems like the more objective conclusion is we were able to increase C15 in 1 of 2 people. However, there were no clinically meaningful changes to the biomarkers that we measured in this short-term trial.
That would be a nice conclusion for this paper.
Okay, so what about cholesterol? Because that's another biomarker that I think people are really interested in. And you mentioned that Chinese study, the Tango trial, and I think that is the trial that is often used to say that C15 can reduce LDL cholesterol.
Yeah. I wouldn't doubt that it's used to say that, because that's what they concluded. It would have been nice if they had showed the data to prove that, which they didn't. They looked at about 20 different outcomes in terms of body fat, BMI. And this was a study, again, 12 weeks, 300 milligrams of C15 versus a control diet that was identical but didn't have the C15 in it. They looked at liver amount of fat, and these were women who had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So they had fatty liver. Okay, so that's a good group to study, reasonable. They looked at visceral adipose tissue, subcutaneous adipose tissue, total body water, blood pressure, hemoglobin A1C, sleep, and some lipids. But they actually don't even report that. And all the things I just listed, there was no change in none of those things. They did show a figure in which the authors state that LDL-C was lowered significantly in the C15 diet, but they don't actually give any numbers. They don't tell you that it went from 110 to 108, and it was statistically significant, something like that, which would have been handy. They just claim that it went down, but they don't provide the data.
It's a very interesting way I've never seen a study present the data like that.
Did you look at this thing?
Figure 3, I think it is, where there's that interesting graph, and I looked at it and I couldn't get my head around the way they were presenting the data. Rather than showing you the change in cholesterol from baseline to the end of the study, it seemed like they were showing it on a weekly basis. It wasn't very clear to me, to be honest.
Well, yeah, the x-axis of this figure, the title of it is Coefficient of Week by Diet Interaction. Do you have any idea what that means? I don't.
No.
I don't either. But there was some coefficient of interaction of week by diet. And why a journal would allow this to be published without just giving I look for supplementary data. I feel, they put the real numbers in the supplement, They didn't have any supplementary data.
Right, because if that had have shown, let's say, 10 milligrams per deciliter reduction compared to the Mediterranean diet without the C15, then all of a sudden you might be thinking, well, that could be clinically meaningful for this outcome.
Theoretically. Yeah. I mean, and that would have been fine. It's just for some reason, they hid it and they just claim it. And then they said there was a potential improvement in the microbiome, which is a whole nother kettle of fish.
You've been deep in this area of researching omega-3s for like 4 decades plus. How do you feel when you go on Fatty15's website and you see this? They have a direct comparison of C15 to omega-3s, and they say, and I have a quote here, "Science has advanced like 100 years since fish oil. Your health should too." And then they go on to say C15 has 3 times more cellular benefits than omega-3s.
It's very disappointing that they're again. I don't know. Do you get the FCC involved? Cellular benefit. What does that mean? Right. I mean, the layman has no idea what that means. And actually, the way they added, and even the way they added the fatty acids to this petri dish of other cells was incorrect. They didn't add it the right way. You're supposed to combine it with albumin. This is the way you always do it, because fatty acids bind to albumin in the blood, in the plasma, and then that's what you put in the cells. And they didn't do that. They put it in I can't remember right away what other way they did it, but I've talked with researchers who study fatty acids in vitro, in petri dishes, in cell culture. And they said that's the way these guys did it is completely incorrect. So I don't believe any of it. I don't believe the way they did it, and I don't believe the way they interpreted. I think their specialty is extreme extrapolation of data.
It's curious to me, Bill, that there is even a direct comparison being made to omega-3s, because even if, let's say, C15s were beneficial, it's a very big leap to then position it as an alternative to omega-3s that have very specific roles in cardiovascular health, in central nervous system health. It would be like saying oil is important for running our car engine, so don't worry, you don't need petrol or gas. Right?
Yeah. You mean like maybe both and is maybe the real answer?
Yeah, and that
Exactly.
would be if there was evidence that in the first place that oil, or in this case C15, was beneficial, which we're questioning.
But your question was more about the range of omega-3 research. I mean, there is plenty of even huge randomized trials in thousands of people showing that just not giving them fish, giving them EPA or DHA will decrease risk for cardiovascular events, decrease risk for total mortality in some studies. Where's the C15 study like that? Nowhere. Where are the studies where they've actually given like omega-3 for C15 to animals, like they've given it to omega-3 to animals, and shown tremendous cardiovascular benefit? I mean, there's a great study from the 1980s where they gave swine a really high cholesterol, high fat diet, and they gave half of them cod liver oil and the other half didn't get it. And they did cross section of the coronary arteries, and it was absolutely clean with omega-3. And there was, plugged up with all kinds of crap on the control diet. And, this is a side-by-side picture in the New England Journal. Where is that C15 study on a disease endpoint? I haven't done it. The omega-3 story goes so far back and it goes back to the 70s. Okay, I don't know what the 100 years is all about. I don't know where that came from. But the evidence base for omega-3, I think, is like the 5th most researched molecule in history, tied with folic acid. Okay, so that's C15 has got to be like the 1,000th most researched molecule, or the 10,000th. So they just haven't got the data. I think it's fine to do these studies and explore them, but I think you need to interpret the data conservatively, and you need to hold back until you've got real evidence of what you're saying is true. And if you don't have it, I don't think you should say it.
Right, and it seems it's potentially dangerous to kind of convince someone that this is a better alternative to omega-3s, which is what some of this wording suggests or implies to me. It's a little bit crafty, the wording, but particularly if we're let's say we're talking about someone who has cardiovascular disease, high triglycerides, is on a 4-gram dose of EPA, which has been fairly well substantiated in the research, and then all of a sudden they're thinking C15 is a viable alternative to that.
Oh, yeah. And if that then takes them off their omega-3 and puts them on C15, and they think they're in better health, they're going to be sorely disappointed. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much physicians are getting questions about this, or patients are asking doctors about it. But I assume the doctors are less informed than you and I are on this thing.
Well, they seem as part of their marketing sort of play to have got a lot of well-known, at least online, doctors on board, and I think probably people haven't really double-clicked on a lot of the science and the story. Just at face value, it does sound compelling, right? If you were engaged, Bill, to work with this company, and I'm not saying you would be or ever will be, but you kind of just spoke. You kind of just spoke to some of the science on omega-3s in animals. What science would you recommend that a company like this invested in to better substantiate their product, or what would convince you that people should supplement with C15?
Yeah, I'd like to see a properly powered study. And let's just talk about LDL cholesterol. I don't think that's the end all and be all of heart disease by any means, but it's a well-known marker. Or blood pressure. Take people who've got elevated LDL cholesterol, take them off their statin, don't have them on a statin, or take them with a statin. Add C15 to people who are on a statin. That's fine. I don't really care, but do a randomized trial where give half of the people 200 milligrams of C15, the other half get a placebo, and see what happens to their LDL, see what happens to their HDL. I mean, you can imagine a situation where LDL would go down, but HDL would go down too. Or the triglycerides might go up, or, or their blood pressure might go up at the same time their LDL cholesterol is going down. Yeah, you just got to do the studies and see what the stuff does. You can't just guess from some sprinkle on a petri dish type study. It's just silly the drug development world uses some of these certain cell lines in petri dishes to study potential new drugs, but 99% of the ones that are effective in cells don't work in people. So it's no guarantee at all that something is going to be translated from a petri dish experiment to a human being. Just there's simple studies to do. These are piece of cake studies to do. And if they really had the money, they'd want to do an outcome study. Recruit 5,000 people with high risk for cardiovascular disease, give half of them C15 and half of them placebo, and follow them for 5 years and spend $200 million doing it. They're not going to do that. So they have to depend on cell culture studies to try and say there's something beneficial to this. So, the studies are doable. I would hop on board if they showed good evidence of does it knock down inflammatory marker levels?
It's an interesting thing to think about more broadly here, because I kind of have mixed emotions. Like, in some respect, I like the fact that a supplement company is doing science, but then I question, how much of this is actual science to see the true effectiveness of their product versus marketing. And there might be listeners hearing us and thinking, well, most supplement companies aren't doing any science. At least this company's doing some, and we're being a little too harsh.
Well, fine. But if the science that they're doing is to nitpick and cherry pick a particular outcome, some of their studies, they go into it thinking this is going to show that C15 reduces hepatic damage, liver damage. And they find out it didn't really do anything to liver, but look, there's something over there on, what was it? Some ferroptosis, some process.
Hemoglobin or something.
Yeah. So instead of saying they're just looking through all the data to see what changed, and then they say, look, this is what happens. And it's going fishing. And it's just not the way you do good science.
What would be, much more, I'm not sure, endearing, trusting, is perhaps a better word, would be a company that says, hey, we're dedicated to science, and here's our kind of roadmap over the next 3 to 10 years, things that we'd like to study, and not overstating the results that they're getting along the way.
Right.
But that might lead to less sales. So it's a balance between the commercial element and the science element of these endeavors.
I don't know what they're doing with the current advertising. Maybe they're trying to raise venture capital money to get enough funds to do this kind of research, but they're certainly making a lot of claims before they do the research.
Another one of those claims, Bill, is that C15 is a longevity nutrient.
Oh, that's cool.
I have a couple of quotes here. So Fatty15 delays aging to help you live better for longer. And more specifically, that C15, and this sounds highly technical and perhaps convincing, C15 activates AMPK and inhibits mTOR and targets the 6 hallmarks of aging.
Targets, but it doesn't hit them. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know. It sounds great. AMP kinase, mTOR, great. Important regulators of omega-3 does that too, as a matter of fact. But I don't believe that they've demonstrated in humans where it counts that these things happen. You can build a whole company on petri dish experiments or mouse experiments and try to extrapolate them to humans, and it sounds great, but the human data are not compelling. And that's where it counts. Obviously, that's where it counts. So,
yeah, I went and looked at the paper that they kind of cite when they make their longevity claims, and it seems like in the paper they actually do compare to omega-3s and metformin and rapamycin, but rather than either showing hard outcomes, they just commented on the fact that C15 acts on some of these similar pathways, but there's no information on the magnitude of effect or what that means for a particular outcome. So it kind of just, at face value, to someone who perhaps is not trained, might, because this is a hot area, right? These anti-aging compounds of rapamycin and metformin. It's at face value, it seems compelling that it's just being thrown into the same conversation.
Yeah. Oh, right. Just right. To say it does in cell culture, it does the same thing as rapamycin. Ergo, taking it will make you live longer, without doing even a mouse experiment to see if, how long do the mice live with and without C15. That's pretty straightforward. That would be some evidence anyway that in a living system, C15 actually increased longevity. But you can't just say it because it affects a certain enzyme, therefore longevity. It's just not. This is it's extrapolating far, far beyond the data.
What kind of study would they need to support a longevity claim?
Well, like I said, one of the simple ones is you take a group of mice that don't live that long anyway, randomize them to a diet with C15, without C15, and you just let them. I mean, maybe you can pick up. I know one study was done with an autoimmune mouse model for omega-3. So you take that mouse model, and they die within a year or so of. So you do the experiment for a year. You take autoimmune mice and give half of them C15 and half of them not, and then you just count the dead bodies every day in the cage. And then after everybody's dead, you look at the curves and say, oh well, the group that got C15 lived on average, 20% longer. That'd be great evidence. I mean, it wouldn't be proof that it happens in humans, but it would be something.
It would be enough to warrant studying it further in humans.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So, but I'm not holding my breath for that experiment.
I know you're not a patent attorney, but
no, I'm not.
You're a scientist and you've been involved in the business side and commercialization of supplements. I have to say, I thought it was interesting that this company was able to patent a fatty acid. So they're the only company that can actually sell a C15 supplement in the United States for humans or for animals.
Is that really true? I mean, I don't trust anything they say. Does it show does a link to the patent from the patent office?
Yeah, so it says any entity other than Fatty15 that is marketing or selling C15 as a supplement in the US or any other covered countries is infringing on patents from the US Navy and the United States of America. And they had a patent number there as well.
Okay, that's probably very challengeable in court, because if that patent was based on Stephanie's work with dolphins in the Navy, that's a whole different thing than selling a C15 product. I mean, I haven't seen the patent, but I would bet you, given what they do with the science, it's possible that the claims of that patent are being stretched a little far.
Right, because I saw that and I was just thinking more broadly, it's interesting that scientists can use the scientific method, use public funding in some cases to research human health, and then with that knowledge secure a patent that really would seem to make that product far more expensive and less accessible.
Yeah. Well, and you can't patent a gene. How can you patent a fatty acid that's natural in the world? That's in every diet. How can you do that? I don't know how you patent a fatty acid. But, I'm not saying it can't happen. I just don't understand. I mean, nobody can patent EPA.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking it's not like one company owns the rights to be the only company that can sell EPA or DHA.
No, right. I mean, you can develop EPA as a drug like Amarin has, like Mochito in Japan did, but that's an ethyl ester. That's not strictly speaking, that's not a dietary fatty acid. It has to be converted into it, and you can treat it like a drug. You can study it like a drug, but only because you want to get insurance reimbursement on the use of the drug, which you can't get on a nutrient. So anyway, maybe it's patented, maybe it's not. I'm highly skeptical. I don't really trust what they say on their website in terms of science, so I'm not sure I trust that either.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Well, Bill, thank you very much for coming back on and joining us again. Was there anything else that you wanted to add that perhaps we missed or that you wanted to leave the listener with?
Well, I think just need to be open-minded about this, but also be smart-minded, and don't just believe marketing when it's, again, you're right, Simon, that the vast majority of people are not trained enough to look at the science and see beyond and see what the extrapolations are being and the assumptions that are being made. It's disappointing that the scientific community, particularly the people that are publishing these 2 articles, are not being a little more forthright on exactly what they're finding. So I think in time the truth will come out, and we'll find that this stuff doesn't do anything. And all you got to do is move from non-fat milk to 2%, and you're done.
Right. Well, in the meantime, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that use their hard-earned money on the supplements. So let's hope we find that out sooner rather than later. Bill, please remind people where they can find you online to read more about your research and all of your work.
I think Fatty Acid Research Institute. Just look up the Fatty Acid Research Institute, and there's a page with my research on it there. That's the easiest place. Or Omega Quant Analytics is another place too.
Perfect. I'll make sure both of those are in the show notes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
We really appreciate your time today.
Good to chat anytime, Simon. Take care.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.